What's up, amigos? Commander Jaime here today, and I'm super excited to show off a top 8 Nightrose deck profile. Shout out to Robbie Cole, also known as MCO Games, for running this premium event. Thank you, amigo, for Midwest players to basically show up and have some fun with premium. Also, shout out to Albert as well from WCC. So he actually judged the event too and helped out. So thank you again as well for judging. Always appreciate your judges. And I'll make this deck profile not as much in depth as the cards itself. It'll be more about like the matchups and how they came up. Also, at the end of the video, I'll talk about like how the format was because it was best 2 out of 3, and also my experience, and also some suggestions and realizations when it comes to these format regulations with premium format. So of course, the 3 Nightrose G. So this came out with the Bend the Roam turns, super vital when you're going first. The GB2 skill actually came up offensively for me against the Chaos Breaker matchup. There was a scenario that I was on Beatrice and essentially only had 1 CB2 spare, and I didn't have an extra Beatrice in the drop zone just yet. So I was able to do a bad bounty turn still, but also just rewriting Nightrose G to be able to use her GB2 skill to revive Skull Dragon to extend another Skull Dragon attack, essentially. The 1 copy of Nightrose V, this is vital for the bad bounty turns, especially when you're doing wombo combos, extending with Nightstorm as well and Beatrice. All those units get 5k, and it's just very solid overall. 2 copies of Beatrice, it's still vital. This is also, you're like going second. This is an ideal right target. You get to Soul Blast and revive something. Targets that I revive throughout the event are like Rough Seas Banshee, Greed Shade, Grenache. Just have like that extra superior call that you may need, depending if you're going into bad bounty or if you're going into an Obadiah turn as well. Also, one of my opponents didn't know about the Ghosty power up. Like if you guard with Ghosties to get extra shield, and also they gain intercept, so the ones on the front row can intercept as well. So that actually came up about twice in my run, essentially. Of course, Skull Dragon is our beater that we heavily rely on, and just abusing this guy multiple times was making people sweat, to be quite frank. And this is also a great right target against the Chaos Breaker matchup. I had to do this a couple of times with Bad Bounty, just making that second Vanguard attack very strong, especially once they get to the point where they locked most of your circles, if not all of them too. And it just really depends on the cards they have and the cards that you have to be able to like fizzle or not fizzle against that matchup. The One Night Storm, this is our attack extender. This is really our go-to guy. So on Obadiah turns, you'll be generally doing 4 to 5 attacks, and really you'll be setting up your board as well, using like Forbiddle and all that stuff too, and making sure you have a Grenache to be able to countercharge and be in a position where you have a decent sized hand, but also have some pressure thanks to Night Storm. And you could abuse cards like Ghost Ship to draw an extra card or 2. You can apply that pressure with Skull Dragon as well. And then, of course, with Beatrice, you'll have that 5th attack if needed as well. These cards kind of go together. There's the Forbiddle and then the Englarf or Sea Strike as well, whatever you want to call it. This came up going second with you going into Obadiah immediately, being able to build a field and get what you needed. Englarf is also useful, not only grabbing a Forbiddle, but also just getting like your grade 3 heals throughout your turns. This can come up late game as well. It's interesting scenarios too. If you rode essentially a Beatrice or Nightrose V that's stuck on your Vanguard circle and you're able to ride a new grade 3, but you still had to get it out of soul, especially if you're doing like a bad bounty turn, for example. You can use Negrabone to revive Sea Strike, Soul Blast a Nightrose V, and then grab a Beatrice, then call the Beatrice to superior call a Skull Dragon or a Ghost Ship at that point too. So you're able to get it out of soul, but also set up like your initial attackers for a bad bounty turn or even a Bartholomew turn as well. The ditch for drawing 1 card effect actually never came up. I would discard something else because I would want to keep this in hand and actually use it to get a grade 3 heal or just another grade 3 that I needed, essentially. So that was more valuable in my eyes. So I actually didn't get to use the ditch and draw strike skill, essentially. 4 copies of the grade 3 heals. I didn't feel like I needed Dewey the Ghosty to be able to counter charge or soul charge. Having these grade 3 heals also helped me survive in those early games, especially when I went second too. There was multi-attack decks such as Great Nature, Aqua Force, and also the Granblue Mare that I faced, and so going second, these helped a lot. And then also, like, if you wanted to stay at low damage against certain decks, you can minus crit to them as well and just stay at 1 damage ideally at that point too. And again, thanks for them being grade 3, you could just grab it with Sea Strike. So starting with the grade 2s, we are playing 4 copies of Columbard. This card is really your ideal right target. It has come up pretty much in most of my games where you grab a Ghost Ship, a Honolly, a Greed Shade, and then if you are on turn 3, this is another card that you can just grab Grenache right off the back if you go into Bandit Rum, just so you just have it, and also counter charge back to like all available CC, because you typically have like 1 to 2 CB if you're going first with the Bandit Rum turn. Like your opponent isn't going to give you a lot of damage because they know that you'll abuse it essentially too. So this card was vital in getting those key pieces that you needed to. Also, even in the late game, this came up in the Bartholomew turn where I actually was like over 30 cards, but I just wanted to double check and also decked in. So when I did the Negrabone play to revive another card, I actually revived Columbard to fetch out the Necrobone back out of deck and then actually revive like a Skull Dragon in its place or something like that. This is a situation where you still want to, you have enough deck size to not deck out, but also like you still need that drop count to be at a position where you're not like so stressed about making sure you're always at 30 essentially. So that helped a lot too. There was one game I actually used this defensively. So I went into Negro Lily, into Beatrice, into Colombard to get Grenache. So that actually came up in one of my games too. And then another game that came up where instead of Grenache, I actually grabbed Cannoneer from the deck and actually popped something. One copy of Ghost Ship. This guy is really important because he gives you that draw. Like having those extra cards just to be able to like guard whiff or ditch whiff is super valuable. And also helping you with having a healthy hand and also getting some, so just having that 24k beater. And then this card also will be 29 with the Obadiah Call, or 26 with a Bandit Realm Call as well, or a Nightrose Stride Skill Call too. So just super helpful card. One copy of Greed Shade. Actually, I was actually tempted to take this out right before the event, and I'm glad I did not. Greed Shade actually came up a couple times. There was one game though that was really annoying where I needed Greed Shade, but he was stuck in the damage zone. I basically needed to grab a PG. I got actually perfect guard against something, and then even if you're using Glarf to get the grade 3 heal, since we're not playing the on-place PGs, I can't like G-guard into a PG essentially. So like that one niche scenario was like, that actually came up for me, and I'm like, dang, I wish Greed Shade was available in my drop instead of being stuck in the damage zone. Would I bump it up to 2? I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's just one of those niche scenarios, but I did want to just to mention it too. The one copy of Jesse, if your opponent's also eliminating your damage too, which happened a couple times during the event, this was one of those cards where like it enabled bad bounty turns, a lot more flexible. It also like Obadiah turns if needed to. And you could also get cards out of like the field to get into Bartholomew, which actually came up in one of my games. So I actually forced cards out of my board and then also took advantage of a counter charge thanks to Jesse the Ghosty. The one copy of Cannoneer, as I mentioned already a couple times, it actually did come up a couple games. And then in the granblue Mare, I actually didn't use it, but it was there, like the threat itself. I actually ended up using like Connolly, for example, in one of my Negro Lily plays instead. But just knowing that Cannoneer is a thing, it just makes players like really have to think and they have to play around it. I think it was like 4 players that actually had to sit there and really think out their turn on how to deal with it to begin with. So in this deck list, I swapped out Riveting Frange for the Gold Dragon just because in my experience, I'm usually facing a Narukami player. That's just how it's been for me at least. Funny enough, this event, I did not face Narukami, and to be quite frank, I wish I would have taken Gold Dragon out for Riveting Frange or even a 4th Tommy the Ghosty. I actually ran into some ride issues with G assisting a couple times in some of my games too. So having like a Riveting Frange or a Tommy the Ghosty would have been much more appreciated than this card. Also, half the time this card ended up into my damage, which was really weird, but I guess it worked out because I didn't need that card in those matchups anyway. Or worst case scenario, I think one game I actually wrote it as Vanguard because I didn't have Colombard, but I was like, okay, this is not bad. Impix. So Impix actually came up in this a couple times, mainly against Chaos Breaker. In the first game that I had with Chaos Breaker, I was able to draw into Impix, and then later on, once I had to do that 1-lane column with Skull Dragons and stuff, I just made it so that Impix would protect that role in case like if a card like Greed Shade was still there. Because in those matchups, you kind of want to use Greed Shade or Sea Strike to get your pieces to make sure you're still living against Chaos Breaker while still making bad bounty turns still. So you may not always have like a Skull Dragon or a Ghost Ship that will remove itself, and so just having Impix there is just really nice at that point too. And it's an annoying card for them to try to get over it and get rid of it too, because they can't lock it at all. I had this against the granblue Mare as well, just to have it there, but I don't know if it was really a threat at that point. I didn't actually had any opponent go into Bartholomew against me. That's usually what that card comes up potentially. But I still rely on Urjula to actually protect my Night Storms and also my Skull Dragons against like other disruptive plays too. So to a degree, Impix did help a little bit, but again, it's like heavily matchup dependent. Onto the great ones with the PGs, I am playing the 3 copies of Water Spout Jin. This lets you counter charge. This actually came up a couple of times. There's one game that I wish I had it to be able to pop off, but I didn't have another copy in the drop zone at that time. So that's one of those things that if you ride this as Vanguard, it's not bad. You can actually Soul Blast it later on immediately. So you have access to counter charge much more faster too, especially if you're very dependent on using Negro Lily plays. It doesn't necessarily have to be a Cannoneer, but you can revive other stuff like Connolly, for example, or even a Greed Shade, and then just have the flexibility of getting guard value effectively, but also just being able to have a PG that will give you that counter blast back essentially too. Especially against matchups like Chaos where like they're pretty much crit 2 for most of the time because Chaos Breaker has that grade 2 that makes the Vanguard crit 2, and then of course they have that one stride that takes away markers and then gets crit on top of that as well. So just having a PG when they take away markers or use the markers to fizzle and getting a counter charge at the same time actually really helps out and works out. So you're not so heavily dependent on a Grenache, especially if they can lock your back row with their own G guards too, which usually Grenache is in the back row too. And the 4th Sentinel is basically the Sanctitude. So this, I mean, Sanctitude is what Sanctitude. It never really came up in a niche matchup where like, oh, I can't guard, blah, 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 use a blitz order kind of thing. But it is there, especially against the Mayor with Bartholomew. We're playing 3 copies of Tommy the Ghosty. This helped with consistency. This was your ideal right target. It helped with getting some great 3s that you needed, whether it be the heals, the Beatrice, the Nightroses, and stuff like that. If you grab the Skull Dragon, you can immediately discard it too. So it just depends on the matchup that I had. I felt like a 4th one would have been appreciated, but again, like Riveting Front could have been the same thing as well. So it just really depended on what you want to take out and put in essentially. This is also a good booster too. You can make like those 13k boosters or 18k boosters if you did like Obadiah, for example, and you make like numbers that hit over a trigger, especially if you put like a Beatrice or a Nightstorm in front of it. So that way that attack column can still hit essentially. Ursula was very important in this event for me because against like the granblue Mare, just making sure you have an Ursula and Obadiah turns to protect your Nightstorm were vital, because you may be able to do 4 attacks, but you want to guarantee it to actually still apply some pressure. Because if you play granblue and you have a 3 attack turn, it is not the greatest turn to have. So that 4th attack does matter, and potentially 5th attack, while you're still setting up with like resources and hand advantage too. So Ursula just makes it a lot easier. There was a scenario where I came up against the granblue Mare where we both had Honolys on the board, and so it will be 2 counterblasts to actually like attack the 5th battle or more with a regard essentially. And because of that, I was able to use a Nightstorm to revive a Beatrice and then revive Skull Dragon back in front of the Ursula. So I would still get 4 attacks even though I spent the Counterblast, Soul Blast, but now my Skull Dragon is also protected by Ursula, and I can use Obadiah's, drive checks to get the triggers onto Skull Dragon and make those attacks a lot more deadlier with only being 4 attacks, essentially. The Honolyn came up against granblue and Aquaforce, and so the Aquaforce player was a good friend of mine too, Anthony, shout out to him. And he was playing Tetra, and he was going first, and I went second. I actually drew into the Honolly turn 1, and I called it as a booster immediately, so it was just chilling there. He had to spend an extra counterblast to basically make Tetra restand a second time, so he had like 3 Vanguard attacks when I was at grade 2 still. So just Honolly, just making your opponent use resources or making it harder for them is just like super vital. Against the granblue Mare, this was super vital because it really limited it to Obadiah turns like 1 to 2 turns in a row before we can actually push and remove it and all this kind of thing. It's about our resources too, because like you could use Cannoneer to get rid of your opponent's Honolly, but now you use the counterblast to get rid of it, and then it's like, okay, what else can you do, And you can still do plays, but again, you're using a counterblast, and even if you get rid of the Honolly, they can use a Negra Lily to revive it with Beatrice anyway. So like, it doesn't really solve that problem until really your opponent removes the Honolly with its own effect, essentially. We have the Negra Bones. 2 copies was actually not bad. It's thanks to Englarf, you remove a lot of the pressure on using Negra Bone to have those main phase revivals. Again, with the trick with Sea Strike reviving Beatrice and calling it and calling whatever you need, like Ghost Ship and Skull Dragon, is really nice. And this you could be saving for later, especially in a Bartholomew turn where you're pretty close to deck out, but you still want to maintain that 30 and drop. So I did swap out with Peter the Ghosty just to have like that potential play with Beatrice. It never came up. To be quite frank, I could have been playing my SP Grenache. But again, play just to play, you never know, right? The one Grenache you use this to counter charge. It came up often. He was my reliable source to counter charge too, so definitely important. The 4 Rampage State was very useful, just being able to draw defensively. This came up like almost every round too, which is really nice. Going into Soul is a +2. This is something that you could also boost your first attack just to make another threshold potentially, and then shove it into Soul. So overall, great card. So I was still playing with the 1 Wild Seas and then the 3 Rough Seas Banshee. And I appreciated the immediate main phase go into Soul Draw effect from Rough Seas. So if I were to see like Wild Seas, this would be like a later thing, especially making your like Vanguard attacks plus 10k makes that Vanguard swing a little more threatening. But at the same time, like I felt like this was a more consistency boost overall for me while feeding the Soul pretty easily. Like I think I only ran into Soul issues 1 game, and that's because I didn't see a Rough Seas that game. Every other game I was having a surplus of Soul, or I literally just had enough to really take advantage of it, because during your battle phases you're using Beatrice to extend attacks as well, and then during your opponent's battle phase you're going to use Beatrice to have those plays as well. And if you're not consistently rewriting or somehow soul charging, then it just becomes like very limiting in your own experience, in your own matchups essentially. I guess that one concern too is like, what about the 15k shield or the 5k power up? Did that come up? I think maybe once, but not for the rest of the times that I've drove check it or damage check it. It really wasn't a factor. I was always thinking about that during the event too, especially if you're using a Skull Dragon anyway. They're usually big at the end of the game that it doesn't matter because they're gonna get PG'd or just they take the damage, right? And then against Katrina, it could come up, but I actually didn't face Katrina, which was one of the matchups that I was expecting to face at least once or twice, and it was one of the main reasons why I switched to granblue instead of playing Shiranui. You got 3 chat, the Ghost Seed, so this was helpful with striding too, but also like just the Beatrice power up as well. Just 20k shield is nice. And then the one Blessed Flavor OT. Defensively, it came up once, but it didn't really matter. It was against Anthony with Tetra Drive. I already had Hanali and stuff like that in one of the games, and then OT just like solidified it, I guess, but I was gonna be okay. I had PGs and stuff already, and grade 3 heals too on top of that. And then the OT against my opponents, I don't think I had one offensively actually throughout the whole event. In fact, I think I had 1 or 2 opponents that checked it offensively or defensively against me as well. But other than that, it's just really there to get the pieces that you need out of the deck essentially, and then also just being able to like have that crit pressure still. 1 Harmonics Missile. This actually interestingly came up in a scenario where in my second game against Chaos Breaker, I was going second and I got Great Stuck for 2 to 3 turns, and I had to G-assist 3 times and I failed twice. When I failed the first time, I actually wrote Chad the Ghosty onto my starter, and I got the starter ticket. And then later on, once I eventually was able to write like a Tommy the Ghosty onto Chad, this will give you the Guardian ticket shield still. It just cares that if you went second, if you're writing a grade 1 from a grade 0. So I thought I mentioned that. It was a very niche scenario, but it came up. 2 Bandit Rumps, this is very vital going on turn 3. It helped a lot to make, 4 to 5 attacks depending on your resources. I pretty much abused Ghost Ship the whole time just to have pressure, get protect markers, and draw cards. And so I added the second Obadiah this time, and so I was running into scenarios where if you needed to grind out a game, having the second Obadiah was super helpful because you revive a full board at that point, and you can like manipulate your field on how it would look like for that turn, but also like feel like if you needed to get resources into your hand, you can start reviving cards like Sea Strike and Greed Shade alongside with the rest of the cards. And so it's a lot more flexible, and you don't have to mill the second time with Obadiah as well. And they get power up as well. 5k actually kind of is nice, especially if you extend to a 5th attack and you can like kind of distribute power when boosting and not boosting essentially too. And it was very scary every time like you Obadiah to like mill too. You're milling like 5 non-triggers, and so in your drive checks you're pretty much almost guaranteed to see at least 1 crit. It'll be surprising if you drove check and saw no triggers essentially, but just still very important, and I felt like the second Obadiah was super crucial. There was a game where I felt like I could have used the old Obadiah because I got like damage deny later on and I already had done Bandit Rum, but I don't know if it was worth like the room essentially in the G zone. 3 Bad Bounties, I've been tempted to reduce this to 2 because I haven't gotten to the 3rd one in a while recently, but it does come up in those niche matchups like Mega Colony and Chaos Breaker, so I kept it in, and Chaos did come up, but I think I only went into the 2nd Bad Bounty to seal the deal essentially, but just having the 3rd one is vital. 1 Bartholomew, I actually was playing 2 for a while, but I made room for other stuff like in the G-card section. So with this build, I wasn't milling as much, so a 2nd Bartholomew would not come up as often. And so just like, okay, let me just have the 1, and then when I go into it, this would be probably the kill turn anyway. And I actually won my game 2 in one of my granblue mirrors where I went into Bartholomew and they were at 3 to 4 damage and then went to 6 that turn essentially. 1 GB8, there was one game that I almost went into it just to be able to like not have to go through the deck but still have a pressure and it's no damage whatsoever. This was coming out into a time where if we dealt a damage we would lose, and so we purposely were stuck at 1 damage with a CB already used. So like I was trying to see if I could over G-guard essentially and then just come back on the clap back with a GB8, but I was 1 card short essentially, so it did not come up. 2 Negro Lily, so again this came up, and just having the second one actually came up for me, and I definitely recommend the 2. I don't think a 3rd one is necessary too, because again your counterblast is limiting too, and so just be mindful of that. So I did bump up Negro Nora to 2, so there were scenarios where I didn't want to use the CB at all, and if I could use the soul and then use like an OT or some other triggers, just have enough shield, this will be ideal. And also like I was thinking like maybe if I have the second one, then I can probably speed up the GB8 if needed in niche scenarios too. So that's why I went with 2 Negro Nora as well. And then the 2 Oriana actually came out once just to make the Vanguard negative crit or 0 crit. It was 0 crit, I think. Yeah, it was against the Chaos Breaker. I actually did this on their Vanguard attack and left it as that. And if they did check the Brent Gate OT, because I knew that thing was coming and it actually came up but doubling 0 is still 0. So it wasn't going to do anything. Unfortunately, the other unit rigger did see eventual crit, and then that doubled. That doubled the crit, and then eventually saw another crit, and then I'm like, I could not deal with the other column, unfortunately. But it was just really dependent if they got the right order of OT and crits in that niche scenario too. And that's really the deck profile, and those interested how the format laid out. I wanted to share my thoughts and experience too with it too. So Robbie Call made this premium event in the Midwest in Indiana, and I think the turnout was around 20 something players. I could be wrong, he can correct me. And also the rounds turned out to be 4 rounds, and then it was a cut to top 8. Each round was best 2 out of 3 with 50 minutes in the round. And as we were playing, we noticed that we often went into time. It wasn't just me, it was actually other players too. Game 1 in premium would take up most of the time in those particular rounds, essentially. And even if you go into a second game, we noticed players, including myself, would go into time as well still. And if the other person would win in that instance, then they would just have a draw at that point. And so we had actually draws throughout the rounds too. I actually had 2 wins and 2 draws, and it's because I would win game 1 and then I would lose game 2, and then boom, a draw happens. So the tiebreakers really change up things, how that looks too. And I was just like thinking with my friends too on the way back home, is best 2 out of 3 even feasible anymore with premium? I actually reached out to KSC's Richard Garcia to get some feedback from him too, because they also run premium events. The only difference is that they don't have the OT, but they also felt the same way, is that when they had best 2 out of 3s, the events would go so long and the rounds would go into time as well. So even they've switched it where it's best out of 1 now. And essentially, I think my friends and even like KSC has agreed that best 2 out of 3 in premium, it may not be feasible as much anymore because it just takes forever. I know even top 8 was taking forever, and I think probably they were still there till like after 9 o'clock at night, still playing it out, maybe 10 o'clock. And the event started like at 1 as well. So like it's a full day essentially too. Overall, the event was still fun. I appreciate for Robbie being so generous with pricing, and also just like sleeves and promo packs over like throughout the rounds too. That was really cool too. I took a picture with top 8. Top 8 got playmats, as you can see. I'll put pictures on it too as well. All my opponents, I had a great time too, facing them and getting to know some of them too. Some new faces too. I appreciate you guys. And then also some familiar faces too. If I were to do this again, like a premium event, I think best out of 1 would be the best route. And I think everybody will still have fun, regardless of the situation anyway. Till next time, amigos. Bye.